Hello and welcome to another episode of Diabetics Doing Things. We are telling the amazing stories of people with diabetes from all over the world. And before we get started with this episode, I do want to issue a quick content warning. We are going to be talking about near death experiences and diabetes on this podcast. And while we know that sometimes even taking a walk out your front door can be a near death experience with diabetes on a daily basis, if that makes you uncomfortable, please proceed with caution or skip the episode if you have to. All right, welcome to the show, Aren Dodge, RD, LD, CDCES, and person with diabetes. Welcome to the show.
Yes, thank you, Rob.
We are so excited to have you. And let's just give a little bit of context to this interview because we were posting some content and I think I was putting it in an email that, for me this year, I've really come to this realization that people with diabetes, people like ourselves, are living on borrowed time. If we were born at basically any other time in history, like we wouldn't be able to live. And for me, that is hopeful now, today, for the future. But for many, obviously, there are still major obstacles to overcome. And so you reached out and you said, hey, I want to talk about my story and experiencing a true near-death experience with diabetes from diagnosis. So here we are. I'm glad we made it happen.
Yeah, it's just amazing how the universe works sometimes. And here I am doing diabetes education. And when you hear my story, you'll realize how crazy the stars align and things happen for a reason. But I was in seventh grade, and this was back in 93. So this is actually my 30-year anniversary this year.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, I know, right? So I was playing church basketball, and I started to feel symptoms, the normal, like, everybody on the podcast seems to mention the thirsty, the tired. And then something happened that like smacked me in the face that made me realize, like, oh man, this isn't just hungry and tired and thirsty. I actually peed my pants. And when you're 13 years old and you pee your pants, it's a big red flag that something's not right. So we were on our way home from basketball practice, and I went before we left, and of course, drinking a bunch of water, and then couldn't make it to the bathroom. And my mom and I both were like, whoa. So we kind of started looking at the symptoms and things. And the next thing you knew, we ended up hitting there. So there was a big blizzard that came through. I grew up in West Virginia. And so this was the blizzard of 93. And we got hit with 2 feet of snow. And when you live in the country, you want to make best friends with someone who has a tractor and, can plow your driveway. So we lived up on a big hill, and we had luckily friends and family, and they came and shoveled us out so I could go to the doctor. And we just did the walk-in appointment. And my mom came with a list of all my symptoms, which was like I'd lost 10 or 15 pounds already. I had the thirsty, tired, all the symptoms. Like if you'd read it in a book and check all the things, it would be everything. And then I also had thrush, which is like where you get a buildup of yeast in your mouth from all the glucose, all the sugar that was circulating through my body. And I mean, she was throwing him softballs, like, I didn't think anybody but babies would get thrush. And he's like, oh no, everything's fine. Oh, your throat's sore. Let me take a look. And it was, of course, red from the irritation. And he misdiagnosed me with strep and gave me antibiotics. And I went on home. And of course, the recommendation was to drink Gatorade and ginger ale and popsicles and Jello. And I just got worse and worse. And that was on a Friday. So Saturday, I wasn't feeling better, but my mom was waiting for those antibiotics to kick in. And then, being sick on the weekend is never a good plan.
Especially during the snowstorm. Like you want to be out playing in the snow.
Right. So she finally took me to the emergency room. And I was kind of in and out of consciousness at that point. It wasn't making any sense because the pH in my body had gone kind of bonkers from the ketoacidosis, and she had to like carry me into the ER. And luckily there was a lady there that was like one of the grandmas of the team where I'd played softball and basketball with. She didn't even recognize me. I'd lost 20 pounds at that point, was down to like 65 pounds, and had like that gaunt, like, on the verge of death phase. And my mom told me just the first time this detail that I asked her two things on the way to the hospital. I asked her if she could call our children's pastor to see if he could pray for me. And then I asked her if I was going to die. And it like killed her to hear those words. So we made it there. I laid on the grandma's lap while mom checked me in, and she kept trying to keep me from going, into the coma. And I don't remember anything after that. So fast forward, my sugar was 1851. And the number is not like, I mean, it's huge. I've never met anyone else that's lived with a higher blood sugar than that. And it's interesting because I'm in the diabetes world so much, but I woke up 2 days later on a Tuesday, and I was just so lucky. And it's just a crazy story just to even tell now about how close I was. And I was too fragile to transport because there was a big children's hospital up the road. And with the snow and everything, they couldn't really get me there, and had to like conference and kind of come up with a game plan for like giving me insulin and bringing my sugar down slowly, because the electrolytes and everything, that's a really tricky sort of balance to get you back into the normal range. So it was amazing that I survived.
1851. That is super high. I think the highest maybe I had heard prior to that was 1300, and that was a friend of mine, like sort of like a loose tie from my childhood, who I played ice hockey with back in the day, and that he had a very similar kind of like went to the doctor, they misdiagnosed him as something else, and 1300 was the result. But man, what did you feel like when you woke up? Did you, obviously, like, I'm sure your sugars were back at least low, much lower than they were before. Like, did you, and with no recollection, like, what do you remember about your early days, like training you to live with diabetes?
Oh, it was so just as a like for you youngsters out there, this diabetes dinosaur from 30 years ago, it was just right when the food label came out, and it was when they used to do exchange lists. So I got like, you get a serving of protein and a meat, and then a starch, and then a fruit and a vegetable, and it was very regimented in kind of that balanced plan. And my mom, I mean, we had class. I stayed in the hospital mainly because I was so fragile, but to learn all that stuff for a week, and made best friends with the educator there. And I just loved her job. And luckily, my pediatric endocrinologist also had type 1. And it made me want to teach people. And that's kind of how I got into doing like Dodge diabetes is what I'm doing now with trainings and everything.
Well, and you're a registered dietitian, a CDCES, like, dedicating your life to helping people with diabetes and dedicating your career for that. Yeah, I mean, how often do you get to share your story, like, with people quite a bit, of being like, hey, it's pretty bad, but it could have been worse. Could have been 1850 during the worst snowstorm in a century.
Right, right. And I still keep in touch with my pediatric endo, and he's up in Morgantown right now, still working 30 years later. He was just right out of fellowship, so he got trial by fire, with my diagnosis. But I'm so excited and proud that, to have diabetes as, my life's purpose. And it's kind of one of those things when you wake up, you kind of get a lot more clarity. And I was one of those people that got to tell, like, I told everybody when I was back in school with seventh grade, I was letting my friends give me injections, and, telling everybody what had happened. And
How
it's
much? I love that you were that way. Like, how much of that is just you? Is just your personality? Is like nature versus nurture,
100%.
right?
Yeah.
Because we've met a lot of people with diabetes over the years and continue to, and everybody has their, and I think it ebbs and flows, like depending on the season and kind of where you are mentally and physically, like how much you want to share. But yeah, I mean, it really is like a personality thing. Is like there's people who bring people in, and there are people that kind of keep people at bay. And I'd say, like, there's no right way to do it. It's just whatever feels most comfortable for you. But now I'm sure that helps you, really cover a lot of ground really quickly with some of your patients.
Well, you just gain a lot of trust, and you have a lot of empathy about how hard this disease really is. And I think that's the big key is it's every day, 24/7, no vacations. And, to have someone that really gets that is really special. And, I'm just, love how the universe works. It's kind of funny, I mean, looking back now, 30 years later, like, whoa. But
Well, it is kind of it's really interesting, like the passage of time, right? You mentioned exchanges, and in Eritrea, both of us kind of had like this, flashback memory of like, oh man, yeah, remember exchanges? Like, oh yeah, this is 1 carb, and like 1 carb is 15 grams, and like that's how you do this, and um, just like the ways that the diabetes technology and treatment has evolved, and something that we talk about a lot on this podcast is that when someone's diagnosed today in 2022 at the time of recording, hopefully, like there's a chance that they have a dramatically better diagnosis story than for me almost 18 years ago, Eritrea 20 years ago, and for you 30 years ago. And like those things that they told us to keep an eye out for back then are now a reality.
right.
So, for you, like when you have those conversations with recently diagnosed children, families, adults, like how do you use that sort of past context? And, I'm sure that really helped you to have a pediatric endo living with diabetes. And like what kind of advantage does that give you even compared to your colleagues who don't have diabetes? Like just that extra lens to communicate, or, how do you see that manifested in your work?
Um, I would say just being 100% delved in with my finger on the pulse every day, watching my own CGM, doing trial and error with different foods, going out to like a crazy sushi restaurant. Like there's so many opportunities to teach myself with my own diabetes, but then that transitions and translates to help other people with scenarios. Even little things like stress. Like I've had two different moms where their sugars will spike when they get home, when their kids get home from school. So it's like that whole stress response. So we sometimes will like tweak their basal rates or whatever to accommodate for that stress, or teach them how to like be more mindful and kind of calm their bodies down in that stress response situation. So there's a lot of random weird scenarios that I've lived that I can kind of share and troubleshoot with. So it's great experience, and I joke around that God's made me the best dietitian and the best diabetes educator just from 30 years of living diabetes.
I was gonna say there's kind of no better patient than yourself, right? And you mentioned weird scenarios, and as you were talking about, moms whose sugars rise when their kids get home, I would kind of laughed. I was like, man, moms with diabetes need a break and a nap. They are doing so much work. Um, but weird scenarios that we were talking about kind of in our email thread is a little bit about hypo unawareness. And I know Eritrea has or lives with a little bit of that on her side. So we'd love to just have you guys talk about like, hypo unawareness after a long life with diabetes.
I mean, where do I really even start? I used to be super hypo where, like, if I had low blood sugar, I would feel it. If I wake up, no problem. But I think it's mostly in the last like 10 years that if I have a low, unless it's a really really bad one, I do not feel it. I have seizures, really not fun. I'm really thankful for my Gvoke, and I always have emergency glucagon. But damn, hypo awareness really really sucks. I burned my face 1 year, like from like here to here from the seizure. So it's been tough, and I don't really know how to fix it. So I'd love any advice that you have.
Yeah, I mean, I those lows, and I honestly, personally hate to be low. Like when I'm looking at my time in range, and if there's anything more than 2%, like the goal is less than 4% in time in range. So if you guys want to go download your, it's called the AGP report, whether you're using CareLink or the Libre View or Dexcom,
Clarity,
the
yeah, the
Clarity.
Clarity app, yeah.
So you'll be able to see, and if you're more than 4% in that low range and very low range, then you really need to work on bringing that back up, because it's really, you can have those scary events where, I mean, and I feel like it's almost like a post traumatic stress thing where you kind of get anxious anytime you start to go low. And when you feel out of it, you just feel so vulnerable, and it's really scary, especially when you don't have anyone around that can help you or that
I think
knows
it's
your
so
diabetes.
crazy. I think it's so crazy that you say that because I'm one of those people that if my blood sugar is like 180 and like slanting down, I will treat my low because I'd rather be high than have to deal with being low for a long period of time, especially because I don't know if it is part of hypo unawareness or not, but like once I'm already low, it's not an easy 15 carb treat. It's like hours of being low because I've been low for so long and I just didn't notice or whatever. So something that did help was changing my target blood sugar to like 160 instead of it being like 110, which is like on the higher side, so I can catch those lows. But I definitely do have that anxiety if I see the arrow slanting down even a little bit. I'm like, got a treat, time for a snack. Like,
Right. And the speed which you fall makes it feel even worse. And
Ooh,
the nighttime
that's me.
hypos, I think, yeah, yeah.
If I'm falling fast, like if I'm 2 or 3 arrows down, even if my like actual blood sugar is not what we would call like severely low, just that motion. And for me, I always feel like I don't know. I don't know if you guys have seen like Doctor Strange when like they hit the people and their like soul comes out behind them. That's how I feel with a low. I'm like trailing behind my physical body.
Yeah, a lot of people refer to like Inception, that little scene where he's kind of like having that out of body like experience. It kind of feels like where you get the wah wah, like you don't really like hear thing. You feel like you're in a tunnel, and there's a lot of hormones that are kicking in when that happens. So when you have hypo unaware, it doesn't signal those hormones that can help increase your blood sugars naturally. So when they looked at the study, I know we kind of talked about like that. So there's this thing called dead in the bed syndrome, and it's a scary statistic that shows that 6 to 10% of people with type 1 will die in their sleep from a low blood sugar. Now, I mean, that's a super significant percentage. Now, hopefully, with like the automated insulin delivery systems out there, it's going to be better. And then like having access to CGMs more now. But if you don't have that response, like with the hypo unawareness, your body doesn't have that ability to send that stress signal to your body. And what tends to happen, and whether you have a seizure or not with the dead in the bed syndrome, is that your heart can't accommodate and you end up having the heart attack basically, and
Right.
that's what ends up being the cause of death from that low blood sugar. So it is can be really scary and it's really serious.
Well, I think
I
too,
think
like
it's a lot more. Sorry, I think it's a lot more common than people know. I grew up going to Camp Sweeney, so I know a lot of kids with diabetes, and now we're adults, and I can't tell you how many of them from my graduating class just haven't made it from dead in bed syndrome. Like at least 10 out of 30 of us. So it's really sad, and I don't think people talk about dead in bed enough, and I don't think most people know about heart attack part. I think they just think it's a really bad low.
well, I think too, even the name is sort of it's so scary to say, and so I think it is
Yeah.
really, especially when people latch onto it. I remember one of my classmates in college who is a friend of my college girlfriend. I was like helping her move something. When you're an athlete in college, you get asked to move stuff a lot. And her sister had diabetes, had type 1, and I had just gotten onto a pump and I was like telling her about it, and her mom was like very anti-pump in terms of because of the dead in the bed syndrome, because like the pump didn't know, there was no way at that time for it to be connected to a CGM, so it would continue to give you insulin even if you didn't necessarily need it, and she was really afraid of that type of interaction. And so she kind of like told me about it, and I was like, I don't want to talk about this, like I'm going to be okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, dead in the bed syndrome is, that's why it's so important, like you said, access to CGM, access to glucagon, and to have those things covered by insurance, especially like, government insurance or Medicare, Medicaid, like for people who, are on assistance, like they need that stuff in an emergency, because it doesn't matter what your A1C is. If you're the best controlled person with diabetes of all time, like one mix up of an insulin dosage, one accidental or miscalculation of carbs, like, and you could be in real dire shape. And I think, that's something that we don't like to think about a lot. I think it's like a hard place to operate from, but it certainly is like a very hefty mental burden that we have to overcome on a regular basis.
Right, as if like the 24/7 diabetes management wasn't enough, you have that kind of doom and gloom looming in the background of your management, and it's tough because it's like Goldilocks. You don't want your sugar to be too high, but you don't want it to be too low, and trying to find your personalized target is the most important, and it's really hard with social media and seeing everybody's unicorns and all these beautiful graphs to not feel like, "I wanna get my sugars in better control," but the best A1C for you is one where you're not having those lows. So if that's 7%, if that's 7.5, 8%, or it's 6%, you just have to be careful because the lower you run, the more at risk you are for having those severe hypos and the dead in the bed thing.
Aren, talk to me about this because this, you know, we don't have a ton of clinicians on the podcast, so I'm really glad that we're able to talk to this about you. But the target A1C for a person without diabetes is 5.5 to 6. Is like is what the chart always says generally.
Mhm.
And then you have your elevated to normal people, which is like a good A1C level for somebody with diabetes, like well controlled,
Mhm.
well managed. So you got like the 6.0 to 7.0, and then like slightly elevated 7.0 to 8, all that stuff. I've seen a lot of people online talking about the graph, with their A1C in the low 5 or like high 4s in some cases, living with type
Mhm.
1. And so that's like an average blood sugar of like 80 to 75 in some cases on the low
Mhm.
end. I mean, though there are people who are trying to do that like at that target, even though like I've seen the studies, there's no evidence yet to support that has any sort of impact in your long-term health. What are the risks of the sort of the downsides of being so, I guess, type A about that control?
Mhm. Well, remember, everybody's diabetes is different, and I think we're at the cusp of finding out so many more different types of diabetes genetically that it'll be super interesting because I've always struggled with keeping my sugars in range, and I have some other, like I have celiac and some other allergies and things that have where I have a lot of inflammation. But your diabetes is your diabetes, so it's not you against other people with diabetes. It's you and doing your best and finding your target that makes you feel safe and that keeps you from being at so much risk for these complications. And, with that said, I somehow made it through college without a CGM, and I played intramural basketball and went to the bar afterwards. I mean, it was like there were some scary, like, scenarios and situations where, I mean, it's just a miracle
Yeah, I mean,
that
you're
I
reading from
made
my
it.
bio basically. Like, yeah,
Yeah.
no CGM, just vibes. Going to party. Oh, hey, you got some punch that you guys made. Oh, there's probably 400 carbs in this. Like, oh well, let's bottoms up. Let's keep partying.
Right. And I mean, not like I'm not endorsing like the party scene, but like I feel like we have so much better technology right now that I think it's a you have to have a careful balance. So they do know that if you have a lot of low sugars and hypo, so if you've ever had those scary lows, like Atria's talking about, you feel brain dead, man. It's almost like you couldn't count change out in your hand or do mental math or even make a sentence sometimes. I had a really bad low where I couldn't even talk coherently. And that's your brain crying out for glucose. So when you've had a low like that, especially an extended severe low in a long over a long period of time, that can really damage your brain cell. And what they're finding is that a lot of those lows can cause dementia and like that Alzheimer's sort of pathway because of your the body chemistry and all that damage over time. So
Well,
it
your
can
brain
get a
operates
little
on glucose, just like the rest of your, and the brain is so interesting, like neuroplasticity. And I'm really big into metabolic health right now, and I'm trying to kind of translate some of the research that I'm reading for people with diabetes because, I think a lot of times it's people without diabetes or without other chronic illnesses who are kind of leading the way on these studies. And at the same time, like they're using tools that we have to use to survive, and so I think we kind of have an advantage there to like get ahead of the game on some of this stuff. But your brain needs glucose. I was just, as you were telling me, telling us about that low that you had where you couldn't really think or count change. I've had two lows where it kind of was what you were talking about earlier about like extended low blood sugars, because my actual sugars were really not that low, probably in the like high 60s, low 70s. But I just couldn't translate what was happening in my brain out of my mouth, which is unusual for me. I'm a talker, as you guys know, 250 episodes on this podcast. You guys have heard me vomit from the mouth a ton. So for me to not be able to communicate, I had to just be quiet and like just tell my coworkers around me, like, don't worry about me. I'm totally inside my head and I cannot communicate externally. Like, let me just eat some gummy bears.
I have a default setting. So my parents and my brothers say that when my blood sugar is low, I get really quiet and I just start saying, I don't feel good. I don't feel good. And I just like auto mode, like I don't feel good until my blood sugar comes up. It's really weird, but I've been doing it since I was a little kid. So maybe it's like my body's way of like, or my brain's way of being like, this is what we do when our blood sugar is low and we don't know what else to do.
You know, it's tough. It's tough living with a chronic illness that's like so stigmatized. And, you know, type 1, obviously not nearly the stigma of type 2. But when you start talking about things like dementia and you hear, you know, a lot of these talking head podcasts talking about the blood-brain barrier and you know, dementia and Alzheimer's being like type 3 diabetes, and understanding like the role of glucose control with like overall brain health, you know, it really is, it's challenging. It like really kind of like puts in perspective to a person who doesn't live with diabetes, like managing your glucose and managing your sugars and your diet and exercise holistically, you know, can lead, it really has big impacts, like and spillover ripple effects later in your life. So how do you know, when you've been managing patients, I'm sure of all ages and all you know, types of diabetes for some time, like how do you help manage that sort of marathon of diabetes where it really is not a sprint, it's a thing that we have to manage day in and day out, full-time job with no vacation? How do you manage that like later in life and like set people up for success?
It is 100% like that marathon. And you have to balance. You were talking about those type A's that have the 4%, like ish, like 5%, even less than 6%. Like that's a lot of work to maintain. So you have to have that life balance with your diabetes and your sanity and how much it's worth. And I think that since so I've been on the automated insulin systems for a couple years now, and that's probably been the biggest thing where I can almost for a brief second almost forget I have diabetes, and it'll steer for me and I feel confident. But you know, I just want to reiterate that again, the A1C is just kind of a guide, but I'm telling you, if you can look at your time in range and if you identify that you're more than 4% below target, again, you are at really, really high risk of having a severe, severe low. And none of that effort that you're doing to prevent long-term complications is going to make any difference if you don't make it, or if you drive your
Right.
car into a tree, or, you know, I mean, it's a really brutal truth, but it's something that we, you know, kind of have to bring to the light.
Well, I'd like to talk about that because, you know, 4 to 5%. I hope that when people are listening to this podcast, they go and plug their CGM into the Clarity report or into their InPen app, or, you know, generate a report from their, you know, pump through their, you know, Care Link. If they see, like, you know, say somebody's got higher than 4 or 5% of low blood sugars, or, you know, extreme or severe low blood sugars, you know, in that 2 to 3% range, like higher percentage than you would recommend, what are some of the steps that they need to take? And obviously, like, you know, consult your doctor, consult your care team, but you as a CDCES and a registered dietitian, what steps would you recommend taking? Just broad strokes.
Yeah, so it's actually pretty specific, and it's actually nice because it's sort of laid out for you. So think about your diabetes as a thermostat. So if you're used to hanging out at the 300 number, even going to 100 is going to feel low to you. You're going to have symptoms. And so with hypo unaware, what happens is your body just kind of gets used to being low. And that's not a good thing. So your thermostat is set below your target range, and nothing's going to be alerting your body that, oh, it needs to like activate and release that cortisol and all those hormones that help naturally bring your blood sugar back up, or tell your heart that it needs to compensate and work harder so that you don't have that heart attack with the hypo unaware. And so what they found is that thermostat has a time estimate for 2 weeks. So if you think back to when you were diagnosed, it took about 2 weeks for you to kind of feel better and feel normal in that target range of blood sugar and not feel hypoglycemic when you got to 100. So 2 weeks is the sweet spot. So that might mean, like Aisha did, where you upped your target range. You were very aggressive about not going below 90, even setting your Dexcom or your Libre or CGM alerts to again let you know when you hit 100, so that you can catch and bump and nudge that blood sugar back up into that target range and not ever really see those low numbers, so that it readjusts your diabetes thermostat. And in 2 weeks, you should feel symptoms again once you go below 60 or 70 or in those scary low sugar ranges. And if you can maintain that, it's almost like a reset button. So that's what I would definitely recommend for people. And again, 2 weeks, even if your blood sugar average goes up to 150, 200, 250 even, it's the safety factor. That 2 weeks is not going to matter in the scope of your projected complications from diabetes, but it will save you from not feeling your lows and having those scary emergencies with hypos.
My doctor always says this thing. She's like, I'd rather us deal with high blood sugars and figure them out and have the time to figure them out than you die from a low and us not be able to figure it out. So, and I feel like that's a really good way for me to just be like, I'd rather be high for a week or a week and a half figuring it out than being low and not getting the chance to figure it out.
Yeah, I was on a panel. That's actually how I met my endo, which this is the most Rob thing of all time. Is I met my endo on a panel, and it was a off to college panel, and so we were kind of talking about what we were talking about earlier about, you're gonna want to go out. And I was telling parents, I was like, your kids are gonna drink alcohol. Like, I don't care who they are. Like, that's gonna happen. Like, just get comfortable with it. And my doctor was, now my endo was on the panel, and he said, yeah, like the worst thing that happens if you go drink a bunch of mixed drinks out and you come home and go to sleep, you wake up a little bit high. He's like, but one thing that I don't want you to do is to, go out and have, really be like overzealous about bolusing for alcoholic drinks when you don't really know how much sugar is in it and all those things. And he's like, we can live a couple hours being high. That's not gonna, but what I don't want is for you to give too much insulin, be impaired by alcohol, so glucagon doesn't work and get into a situation where, you could potentially die. So yeah, I mean, I think that's right. Like, a little high blood sugar here and there, like, don't beat yourself up. You can adjust and move on from that. And, on the other end, however, it's very dangerous and very severe with severe hypoglycemia.
Right. And that little caveat with the alcohol, if you think about the symptoms of being intoxicated and the symptoms of low sugar, they kind of like mesh and meld together to where it's hard to tell the difference. Have I had too much to drink, or is it my sugar's going low? And then if you drink excessively to the point where you're not really feeling it, you're not with it, you're kind of like, passing out, those symptoms your body tries to tell you when you do hit that low threshold to kind of wake up, get something to eat, it doesn't work. It doesn't trigger, and you just sleep right through it because you're passed out from too much alcohol. And those are honestly probably the scariest scenarios. And that's when you do see a lot of dead in the bed and admissions to the hospital, and people not doing well because of the combination of those two.
For sure. And, there's a lot of research coming out now, even, at the time of recording this week on the Huberman Lab podcast, which I don't know, you guys who really know me know that I love Huberman Lab. Even one drink a day, like, one drink 3 times a week makes your neocortex smooth. Like, it's super bad for your brain. Like, and we're talking a lot about your brain health. Like, the brain is part of your body, but your mind lives in your brain. And even though it is on record, I have drank alcohol. I've had fun. I have been Mr. Party Guy. And, I'm also entering that part of my life where I just become more boring because I'm aging. But alcohol is bad for you. I don't care if you have diabetes or not. And while it is fun and it is a huge part of our culture, and it's sort of the only drug that if you tell people you don't do it, they look at you funny. It's bad for you. And I think we at face value, we just got to remember that when you're living with diabetes and you're participating in things that are totally normal from an able-bodied like and a cultural standpoint, you still have diabetes and you're still going to need to be as hypo aware as possible, and you need to be able to have glucagon work if you're in a tight spot or a bad situation. And right off the bat, those are two things the alcohol affects directly at any time. So anyway, that's my PSA. I'm getting off my soapbox.
Right. And physiology wise, the reason that doesn't happen for anybody listening is, so he's saying that the glucagon won't work when you inject it. And that's because the liver is so busy processing the alcohol that it doesn't release that glucose that your basal insulin is taking care of. So it's like a double whammy where you won't have the glucagon, the glycogen in your liver to help bring your sugar up if you need it. But then also your risk of going low is drastically increased the number of drinks that you're consuming, because it's going to keep your liver from squirting out sugar into your blood. And that's what your basal is handling. So your risk of hypo is through the roof.
Well, man, we have covered a lot of really good stuff on this podcast. Aren, you run a great account on Instagram, Dodge_diabetes. So if you are looking to connect with Aren, or you have questions for her after this podcast, I'd encourage you to reach out there. And the other thing is, like, and Eritrea mentioned this to me, like we came into this podcast thinking we talk a lot about really dark and heavy stuff, which we have. But at the same time, like people with diabetes do, like we're approaching it in a way that's accessible. It doesn't have to be scary. Like we can plan for the worst case and not get caught up in a negative headspace, and like really still say, okay, well, I am going to be prepared. I do need to understand. And, for what, Eritrea and I often talk about in our staff meetings is this could be the first time that somebody hears about drinking and diabetes, or dead in the bed syndrome, or near death experiences in diabetes, or hypo unawareness. And these topics are really important to cover. So Aren, thanks so much for reaching out and connecting with us to come on this episode.
Yeah, thank you so much. Yeah, and you can find me on Facebook as well at Dodge Diabetes LLC, and I have a community on there and post a lot of helpful educational stuff, and do education for one-on-ones. And I have a virtual group course that it's called Be Your Best Pancreas. It's all intricate diabetes for insulin users. So I'd love to see you guys there. And I'm just so blessed and excited to be able to share all the 30 years of experience with diabetes to help others.
Well, and I think, you brought this up earlier, like it was instrumental for you to have a pediatric endo who lived with type 1. And you never know what you're missing out on by not having more people with type 1, especially experts in your life. And we talk about that a lot. A friend with type 1 is a friend indeed. That's a great life hack to get ahead. And we will include all the links to the Dodge Diabetes pages and website in the show notes. So if you're listening to this now, go ahead and click there and check them out.
Great. Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you, Ayutra.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you so much, Aren. And we'll see you next time.